Welcome to Beyond the Hype, the podcast where we cut through the buzzwords and bold claims to uncover how science really works. I'm Professor Frank Marino, physiologist, researcher, and someone who's spent a career asking hard questions about performance, fatigue, and the human limits. Each episode will dig into the evidence behind the latest trends in sport, health, and wellness. What holds up under scrutiny and what's just hype. Join me as we go beyond the headlines, beyond the fads, and beyond the hype. Have you ever felt it? That dry scratch at the back of your throat, your heavy tongue, your sticky mouth, your thoughts narrowing to a single urgent need: water. And then relief, the cool rush as you take the first gulp. That's thirst, one of the most basic human experiences, primal, unavoidable, and essential for survival. It seems so simple. When we're thirsty, we drink. And yet nothing about hydration is quite that straightforward. We are, after all, mostly water. About 60% of our body weight is fluid, constantly shifting between compartments, inside our cells, around our tissues, and flowing through our blood. Keeping this balance is what sustains life. But here's the paradox. Dehydration itself isn't a disease. You lose water, you drink water, and the condition disappears. But go too far the other way. Drink more than your body can handle, and you can enter a dangerous state called hyponatremic encephalopathy, where the brain swells from too much water. And still, modern culture seems obsessed with water. Walk into any department store, Kmart, Target, you name it, and you'll find an entire aisle dedicated to bottles. Some so big they come with handles, like we're preparing to cross a desert or something. In fact, in my own experience, I once supervised a first-year exam that was just 60 minutes long at 9 a.m. Almost every student had a litre-sized bottle on their desk. And I thought to myself, where did they think they were actually going at this time of the day that they needed so much water available to them? And of course, you've probably heard the mantra, drink 8 glasses of water a day. It's repeated endlessly in health magazines, gyms, wellness blogs, and so on. But here's the surprising truth. There's no scientific evidence behind that rule. It's a myth that's stuck, not a medical fact. Now, if you caught episode 1, you'll remember that we talked about how science really works, how ideas get tested, challenged, and sometimes overturned. Hydration is a perfect example. Some rules have become dogma, but when you look at the evidence, the story is far more complex. So today, on Beyond the Hype, we'll explore hydration, the biology of thirst, the science of performance, hydration for health and wellness, and of course, the booming sports drink industry. We'll ask, how much water do we really need, and where does the science end? And the hype begin? We are water-based organisms. About 60% of our body is water, and it sits in different compartments. Roughly 40% is inside our cells. This is known as the intracellular space. And about 20% sits outside the cell. And that's split between the plasma, which is the watery part of the blood, and what's known as the interstitial fluid that surrounds the tissues. These different compartments are constantly exchanging water to keep the cells alive, the blood circulating, and the body stable. So the question is, how does the body know when the balance is threatened? Well, the first line of defense lies in the brain. There are tiny sensors called osmoreceptors. They sit in a region called the lamina terminalis. And this constantly monitors the concentration of sodium or salt in the fluid outside of our cell. If sodium creeps up, it means there's proportionally less water. Now, as an example or an analogy, it's a bit like the salt in our swimming pool. If water evaporates, then the salt content goes up because that's what's left behind. But if we add water, the salt content goes down. But here's the remarkable part. The system, the osmoreceptors in the brain, respond to a change as small as 2 millimoles per litre. Now, if you're not familiar with what millimoles are and what that means, imagine a kitchen jug filled with water. Add just a tiny pinch of salt, less than a 20th of a single grain, and your brain would notice. That's how finely tuned these sensors are. Their signal does two things. First, it creates the sensation of thirst, which we're all familiar with, and this prompts us to go and drink. Second, it triggers what's known as a cascade of hormonal changes. Chief among these is something known as antidiuretic hormone. It's also known as vasopressin. This tells the kidneys to conserve water rather than letting it flow out into the urine. At the same time, the kidneys themselves act as endocrine organs, and they release a hormone known as renin, which leads to the production of another hormone known as angiotensin II. It's a hormone that both stimulates thirst and drives us to retain salt and water. Think of it like a household plumbing system. The osmoreceptors in the brain are like highly sensitive pressure gauges. The hormones are the control switches, opening and closing valves. And the kidneys are taps at the end of the line, deciding whether water should be stored or poured away. It's a nice feedback loop, so precise that even the tiniest leak in pressure, in our case, body water, sets the whole system into action. The result is a beautifully integrated system. Sensors in the brain detect imbalance, hormones mobilize, the kidneys adjust, and behavior changes. We seek and drink water. It's an anticipatory, not desperate response. The system buys us time before dehydration becomes dangerous. But thirst may not have only been about sensors and hormones. There's a fascinating evolutionary angle to all this. For our ancestors roaming dry savannas, finding water sources was life or death. That's not the case anymore. One possible adaptation was our sensitivity to smell. Now, you might be asking, what's smell got to do with thirst? Well, here's the interesting thing. You know that earthy aroma after a rain shower? It was once called argillaceous odour, and later it was renamed petrichor. It comes from plant oils and bacterial byproducts, especially something called geosim. Well, that smell that we can distinctly characterise after a rain, we can detect geosim at concentrations as low as parts per trillion. Think about that. That's astonishing sensitivity. It suggests that the smell of wet earth may once have been a survival tool, helping us locate water after rainfall or track damp soil that hinted at hidden sources. So, when you put it all together, osmoreceptors in the brain, hormonal cascades, the kidneys' fine-tuned regulation, and perhaps even the scent of rain in the air, you see how deeply hydration is wired into our biology and our evolutionary past. And yet, today, we behave as if water were in short supply. Now, of course, in some places around the globe, it is. But remember, the exam I mentioned in the introduction. An hour-long paper at 9 in the morning, and every student had 1 litre bottle on the desk as though they were preparing for a desert march. Our ancestors endured hours of persistence hunting with little or no water, relying on these finely tuned systems. Now, we can't seem to face a 60-minute test without a personal reservoir. It's a striking contrast and a reminder of how far modern hydration culture has drifted from our previous evolutionary design. When it comes to performance, hydration is one of the most hotly debated topics in sports science. For decades, the message was simple: dehydration is the enemy. Early military and desert studies suggested that losing body water impaired work. And this grew into a rule of thumb. If you lost more than about 2% of your body weight in fluid, performance would fall off a cliff. To put that in perspective, that's about 1.5 kilograms for a 75 kilogram individual, or just under 2 litres of sweat. This 2% rule became gospel. By the 1980s and the 90s, athletes were urged to drink well before thirst, to weigh themselves before and after training, and to replace every drop of sweat. Some guidelines even warned, if you're thirsty, it's already too late. But as we know, reality is far more complex. Elite marathoners and triathletes often finish races with 5 to 7% body weight lost in sweat, far beyond the supposed limit. Yet they record their best performances. In contrast, the real danger shows up at the opposite end of the spectrum: drinking too much. Think about this. Is it not a strange thing to happen to put on weight during a long-distance run? So, one tragic example came from the 2002 Boston Marathon, where a young woman collapsed and later died after drinking excessively throughout the race. Her blood sodium fell dangerously low, a condition that we mentioned previously called exercise-associated hyponatremic encephalopathy. Essentially, water intoxication. That's right, you heard it, water intoxication that causes the brain to swell. And this is not isolated. In Australia, hospital data shows that between 1993 and 2000, there were about 7,500 admissions for this condition known as hyponatremia. Over the next 7 years, cases jumped by 63% to more than 20,000. Meanwhile, heat-related hospitalisations stayed flat. This rise isn't just about ultra-athletes. It suggests our broader cultural obsession with constant drinking, fueled by bottled water marketing, and created a very modern problem. The same pattern has been seen in major endurance events. In the South African Ironman, researchers tracked more than 700 athletes. Some lost up to 10% of their body weight in sweat, yet they showed no greater risk of collapse or illness. In fact, the only athlete who ended up in hospital was the one who gained 3 to 4 kilograms during the race, not from food, but from over-drinking. His sodium dropped to critically low levels. He became confused and swollen, and he required hospital treatment. Over the next day, his body dumped nearly 5 litres of excess fluid as urine. The lesson was unmistakable. It wasn't dehydration that was dangerous, it was drinking far beyond need. In our own lab, we tested these ideas directly. In one study, we asked cyclists to hyperhydrate with glycerol. This is a fluid-retaining agent once thought to give an advantage, especially if you're exercising in the heat. Did it help? No. Performance and core temperature were unchanged, and the only measurable effect was that glycerol made them sweat more, with no benefit to performance. In other words, being loaded with extra water was not actually helpful. In another trial, we compared athletes who drank enough to fully replace every drop of sweat with those who drank nothing at all during a 1-hour ride in warm, humid conditions. What was the result? No difference in distance covered, no difference in pacing, and no difference in final core temperature. In other words, replacing 100% of the fluid losses gave no edge at all. When we then examined what happens when cyclists lose around 4% of body weight by dehydration, that's nearly about 3 kilograms for an average rider, before completing a short, intense 5-kilometre time trial, performance again was unaffected. Riders went just as fast whether they were rehydrated or dehydrated, and their muscles produced the same voluntary force. In fact, when we looked closely at muscle responses, we found signs that their muscles were contracting more quickly in the dehydrated state. In other words, the nervous system didn't falter. If anything, it adapted. We think this effect may come from changes at the muscle level itself. Dehydration alters the balance of electrolytes and content of the fluid in the ways that could influence how calcium is released inside the muscle fibre. Now, for those that don't know, calcium is the key signal that allows muscle proteins to grab, pull, and generate force and tension. If calcium release happens faster, contraction can occur more quickly. So rather than dampening force, it seems as though mild dehydration may briefly sharpen some aspects of muscle contractility, even though the broader perception of effort still rises. Now, all of this might sound like an open and shut case. Dehydration doesn't matter much, and overdrinking is the real danger. But we need to give some balance. It's important to say that not all studies agree. At Brunel University in London, researchers have shown that progressive dehydration in the heat places significant strain on the cardiovascular system, the brain, and the working muscles. When body mass loss approaches about 3 to 4%, endurance performance can indeed fall sharply. A little closer to home at the University of Canberra, a research group there emphasised that dehydration accelerates the rises in core temperature and cardiovascular strain. So for athletes training or competing in hot conditions, especially those that are not acclimated, dehydration can impair aerobic capacity and endurance. Meanwhile, at Edith Cowan University and Auckland University of Technology in New Zealand, scientists blinded a bunch of cyclists to their hydration status during 25-kilometre time trials in the heat. Even when they were dehydrated by 2 to 3%, performance didn't change, but core temperature did creep up. This study suggested that sometimes the perception of dehydration may play as much of a role as the physiology itself. At the University of Otago, a group reviewed the field and argued that much of the evidence for performance decrements comes from tightly controlled lab experiments with low airflow and fixed workloads. In other words, in real-world settings, with wind cooling, pacing and behavioural cues, people often tolerate dehydration a lot better. Finally, at the University of Connecticut, researchers showed that thirst itself is a remarkably reliable guide. A simple rating of thirst reliably picked up about 2% of body mass loss, the same threshold often cited for performance decrements. So, where does this leave us? The weight of evidence says dehydration can impair performance, especially in the heat over long durations. But it's not inevitable. The magnitude of the effect depends very heavily on the context. In cooler conditions, with self-paced activity, and when people simply follow their thirst, performance is often preserved. The best strategy, and the one supported across all these different labs, is simple. Drink according to the dictates of thirst. It avoids the dangers of both extremes. Not drinking enough in hot, prolonged exercise or drinking compulsively just in case. So let's do a myth versus reality recap. Myth: performance falls off a cliff once you lose 2% of body weight in sweat. Reality: many athletes compete successfully with 5 to 7% losses in body weight. The 2% rule is an oversimplification. Myth: more drinking always improves performance. The reality: studies in Australia, South Africa, in our own labs, show that replacing 100% of sweat losses offers no advantage and sometimes can increase risk. Myth: dehydration is the main cause of collapse in races. Reality: more hospital admissions and serious cases come from overhydration and hyponatremia, not dehydration. Myth: there's one universal answer. Reality: evidence is mixed. Labs in London and Canberra show that cardiovascular strain with dehydration. Labs in New Zealand and Connecticut show resilience and the value of thirst as a guide. Myth: thirst is unreliable. Reality: thirst kicks in around 2% of body mass loss and is a remarkably sensitive signal. Simple, natural, and protective. What is the bottom line? Drink to thirst. It's the strategy that balances risk and reality, avoiding both the dangers of under and over drinking. Now, let's turn our attention to hydration for health and wellness. When we step away from athletes and performance, hydration advice becomes even murkier. Here, we enter the world of everyday health, wellness culture, and what doctors, dietitians, and influencers tell the public. Let's start with the most famous line of all. Drink 8 glasses of water a day. You've probably heard it in gyms, wellness blogs, and waiting rooms. But a landmark review in 2002 actually showed that there's no strong scientific basis for this rule. In fact, what that review showed was that most people meet their daily hydration needs perfectly by simply responding to thirst. And much of that water comes not from plain water, but from food, milk, tea, coffee, even beer. A following review in 2010 reinforced this point. They found that humans regulate water balance with astonishing precision. Lose just 1% of body water and within 24 hours the body corrects itself through thirst, hormones and kidney adjustments. This fine-tuned homeostasis makes the idea of constant sipping to stay ahead of dehydration sound more like marketing than medicine. And yet, perceptions do matter. For example, a survey of nearly 2,000 healthcare professionals across Europe found that while doctors, nurses, and dietitians rated hydration as very important for health and performance, many misunderstood the detail. They often overestimated how much water comes from food, they underestimated what comes from beverages, and under-recognised hydration's link to mental health. So what does the science actually say about hydration and the brain? Some reviews from the Army Research Institute in the US highlight how contradictory the literature can be. For example, severe dehydration clearly impairs cognition, but at moderate levels, let's say 1 to 3% of body weight loss, some studies show decrements, others show none. What does appear more consistent is that mood and alertness often decline before measurable cognition does. It was this inconsistency that led us to conduct our own studies. So, in 2019, we published what's known as a meta-analysis showing that moderate hypohydration, in other words, the kind of fluid loss people might experience from day to day, actually does not reliably impair cognitive performance. When cognitive impairments actually appeared, they were often tied to how the experiment was designed rather than the dehydration itself. So, in 2020, we asked the question, is it the dehydration or is it actually the sensation of thirst that actually matters more? So to do this, we use something called the Stroop task. And it's a classic psychology test where you have to name the ink colour of a word that spells a different colour. It forces your brain to override the automatic urge to read the word, making it a sensitive measure of attention, inhibition, and potentially mental fatigue. When participants were deliberately kept thirsty, even without big fluid losses, they slowed down, made more mistakes, and brain scans showed their frontal lobes were working harder. The message, in the end, was thirst itself, not just dehydration, can drive mental fatigue. Following this, in 2022, we looked at motor learning. What we did was we had participants practice a simple finger tapping sequence, like learning a piano scale or typing a new password. Both hydrated and dehydrated groups, by about 2.5% of their body mass, learned and remembered the sequence just as well. But the brain imaging showed that the dehydrated group's prefrontal cortex was working harder. Again, performance was preserved, but the brain carried a heavier load. So what does this all mean? Well, across these studies, the message is consistent. The brain is remarkably resilient. It can keep performance intact under mild dehydration, but at a cost. More effort, more fatigue, and a heavier load on neural circuits. And this makes sense from an evolutionary perspective. Thirst is one of our most finely tuned survival mechanisms. In other words, if cognition had collapsed just after 1 or 2% of body water loss, humans could never have survived persistence hunts or endured seasonal water shortages. Instead, evolution gave us a system where thirst motivates us to seek water early, while the brain continues to function effectively even when fluids are scarce. It may not feel pleasant, but it's more than survivable, and survivability is, in the end, what matters. Outside the lab, this plays out in specific populations. Children who depend on adults to provide fluids, older adults whose thirst response is often blunted, and pregnant women where fluid balance affects both mother and baby, and workers in outdoor hot environments who may not have ready access to water. For them, proactive hydration isn't about wellness culture, it's actually about safety. And this is actually a paradox. In cities, people carry litre water bottles everywhere, sipping constantly, convinced they're warding off hidden dehydration. Meanwhile, in rural and remote communities, including here in Australia, safe, reliable water access can't be taken for granted, and hydration becomes a genuine public health issue. So, what's the bottom line? For most healthy adults, thirst is enough. The 8 glasses rule is a myth. Tea and coffee actually count. Mild dehydration in everyday life isn't the health crisis it's made out to be. But for the vulnerable groups, hot workplaces or communities without secure water access, hydration is a serious concern. The wellness industry might frame hydration as a lifestyle accessory, but the real story is actually simpler and more human. Drink when you're thirsty, make sure those at risk are looked after, and recognise that access, not obsession, is the real hydration challenge. So consider this. You never actually tell your dog or cat when to drink. Why do we always insist that we have to tell humans, supposedly the most intelligent thing on the planet, to drink? So let's dive into the sports drink industry, from science to spin. The story of sports drinks begins not with flashy adverts, but with physiology labs in the 1960s. A famous study by Swedish researchers who pioneered the muscle biopsy technique. That is, taking a small needle, they could sample muscle and analyse glycogen, the form of stored carbohydrate in the muscle. Their landmark studies showed 2 key things. Glycogen is the critical fuel for prolonged exercise, and a carbohydrate-rich diet could supercompensate muscle glycogen stores, giving athletes a bigger fuel tank. This was the birth of carbohydrate loading, and it transformed endurance sport. By the 1980s, attention had shifted to fueling during exercise. At the University of Texas, Andrew Kogan and Edward Coyle, famous for their research in this area, demonstrated that ingesting carbohydrate during prolonged cycling maintained blood glucose, sustained carbohydrate oxidation at up to 2 grams per minute. And the end result was that this delayed fatigue. Basically, athletes could perform nearly 20% more work. The message was clear: carbohydrate drinks weren't just topping up the fuel, they were directly supporting performance. In the 1990s, other researchers at the University of Birmingham and Liverpool John Moores in the UK pushed the boundaries. They found that even in 1-hour time trials, carbohydrate ingestion improved power output and reduced the finishing times. In the heat, carbohydrate feeding boosted endurance by more than 10%, even when glycogen wasn't completely depleted. This hinted that carbohydrate benefits weren't only about muscle fuel. They might also be working through the brain. By the mid-2000s, the story shifted again. At the University of Cape Town, they showed that glycogen isn't just an energy store, it's also a signal. In other words, when glycogen drops below a critical threshold, the muscle downregulates its output like a built-in safety governor. Even with glucose available, the glycogen gauge tells the system to back off. A really interesting study in 2010 at the University of Auckland discovered that carbohydrates can influence the brain before it's even swallowed. Using magnetic stimulation of the brain, which is pretty much a harmless magnetic pulse to tap the motor cortex, they measured how excitable the brain's movement center was. They found that simply rinsing the mouth with a tasteless carbohydrate solution increased the excitability of the brain, and they were able to increase their voluntary force output. No carbohydrate had actually been swallowed or metabolized, yet the brain responded as if fuel was incoming. Therefore, carbohydrate is not only fuel and muscle signal, it is also a neural cue. More recently, we examined self-paced exercise, a kind of start-stop work in football, rugby, or hockey. Athletes were blinded to their carbohydrate intake, in other words, removing the placebo effect. Those with higher glycogen stores covered 5 to 8% more distance at high intensity, even though sprint times and muscle strength were unchanged. This supported the idea of an internal glucostat, that is, a mechanism that suggests that glycogen availability subconsciously regulates pacing long before muscles are truly empty. Building on this, we extended the picture a little bit. We showed that carbohydrate feeding actually maintained blood glucose during prolonged cycling. But fatigue wasn't simply about fuel depletion. There were central factors like your perception of effort that also mattered. We also demonstrated that in hot conditions, carbohydrates' benefits were often masked by heat stress. It was thermal strain which dominated pacing and fatigue, and this apparently overrode the nutritional strategies that were used. These studies reinforced a key point. Carbohydrate never acts in isolation. It interacts with heat, hydration, the brain, and pacing behaviour to shape performance outcomes. Taken together, this body of work tells a rich story. Carbohydrate is fuel for the muscles. It is a signal that regulates effort. It is a neural cue that primes the brain, and it interacts with environment and perception to determine performance. So, how do we leap from the lab to the industry? Well, the story actually begins in Florida in 1965. Dr. Robert Cade, a nephrologist at the University of Florida, was approached by the Gators football coaching staff. They noticed that their players were collapsing in the heat, losing weight, cramping, and fading late in games. Cade and his colleagues reasoned that the athletes were losing not just water, but sodium, potassium, and carbohydrate. They devised a simple mixture, and that was water, sugar, and salt with lemon flavouring. It wasn't glamorous. Cade admitted the first version tasted like sweat, but it worked. In 1967, Cade published his results in the Journal of Sports Medicine and Physical Fitness, reporting that the drink improved hydration, reduced weight loss, and helped athletes perform better in the heat. The product soon became known as Gatorade, after the Gators. The success of Gatorade quickly reached beyond football. By the 1970s, even the US military was trialling it in the field as a ration supplement. Soldiers, like athletes, trained and fought in the heat, losing fluids and electrolytes while burning glycogen. Military adoption gave sports drinks a stamp of legitimacy well beyond sport. In other words, if Gatorade was good enough for the battlefield, surely it was good enough for everyone else. By the 1980s, Gatorade was a household name. After PepsiCo acquired the brand, its marketing exploded. Bright colours, iconic slogans, superstar endorsements, and of course, the Gatorade shower cemented its cultural place. What began as a niche solution for football in the Florida heat became a global industry worth billions. But along the way, the message stretched. Hydration guidelines were reshaped with the mantra, "Don't wait until you're thirsty." Athletes and the public were told thirst was too late, that they needed to drink early and often, and not just water but electrolyte-rich sports drinks. As Professor Tim Noakes argued in his book Waterlogged, these guidelines were shaped as much by industry as by science. Dehydration was portrayed as the greatest danger, while the risks of overhydration, which led to hyponatremia, were simply overlooked. One of the most effective marketing tools was the myth of the salty sweater. Advertisements suggested that everyone loses large amounts of sodium in sweat, risking dangerous imbalances unless they replaced electrolytes with sports drinks. In reality, sweat sodium varies widely from very low to very high, and for most people, a normal diet more than covers their needs. But the image of white salt stains on a jersey was simple, memorable, and really persuasive. So by the 2000s, the industry had expanded further. Vitamin waters promised energy and immunity. Alkaline waters claimed detoxification benefits. Coconut water was sold as nature's sports drink. Even oxygenated waters appeared on shelves. The common thread? Well, little scientific support, lots of clever branding. For most consumers, these were just flavoured waters in expensive packaging. So, let's do a myth versus reality recap. Everyone needs sports drinks to replace electrolyte. The reality is, sweat sodium losses vary, and most diets replace them easily. Thirst is too late. You must drink before you feel it. The reality is, thirst is a sensitive early warning system that works for most people. Sports drinks are essential for all exercise. The reality is they help in long, hot endurance events. For daily workouts, water is enough. Functional waters, vitamin, alkaline, oxygenated, provide unique health benefits. Well, the reality is the evidence is minimal to non-existent. They're largely marketing. Sports drinks were built on hype. Reality, the foundation science, that is glycogen, carbohydrate feeding, electrolyte replacement, is solid. The hype came later, when science was stretched to sell a product. So, sports drinks were born from really good science, designed to solve a real problem for athletes in extreme conditions. But once commercialised, they became a solution in search of a problem, marketed to everyone. What started as a lab experiment for a struggling football team became a multi-billion-dollar industry Proof of how science, when taken out of context, can fuel an empire of hype. So what have we learned about hydration? We started with biology, osmoreceptors in the brain, hormones, the kidney, and even the scent of rain in the air, all working together to keep us in balance. We saw how dehydration isn't a disease, but overhydration can become one. We then turned to performance, where the old 2% rule doesn't hold up so neatly. Elite athletes often finish races well below that threshold, and many studies, including our own, show that moderate dehydration doesn't collapse performance. But the balance is important. Drink to thirst, avoid both extremes. From there, we moved into everyday health and wellness. We tackled the 8 glasses a day myth, looked at cognition, and shared our own lab's findings that the brain is resilient, preserving performance even under mild dehydration, though at a cost of more effort and fatigue. Evolution gave us a robust system. If mild dehydration truly destroyed cognition, our ancestors would never have survived water shortages. And finally, we traced the rise of the sports drink industry. From Bergstrom's biopsies to Cade's Gatorade, from the US military to global marketing campaigns, we saw how solid science was stretched into sweeping guidelines and clever slogans. The result? Sports drinks became everyday products, sold to the masses on the back of myths like the salty sweater. The thread through all of this is clear. Hydration does matter, but context matters more. Thirst is reliable, water is usually enough, and hype often runs ahead of the science. In the next episode of Beyond the Hype, we'll turn our attention to another hugely popular trend in sport and recovery: compression garments. From socks to sleeves to full-body suits, they're worn by elite athletes and weekend warriors alike. But do they really aid recovery, reduce fatigue, or even improve performance? Or are they another case of marketing running ahead of the evidence? Until then, thanks for listening to Beyond the Hype.